In 1964, an experiment was conducted in the United States. 3 PhD graduates, who had just received their academic degrees, were gathered, and they were tasked with designing an atomic bomb using materials from public libraries. All of this was called a national experiment to understand how difficult it would be for a nuclear country to create an atomic bomb using open information. Just 3 years later, the experiment was stopped. The physicists nearly reached the required solutions, confirming the experiment's success. It turns out that any country with just 3 really good physicists, not even geniuses, can design a functional nuclear device. But if it's so easy to build an atomic bomb, then why isn't the so-called nuclear club expanding? Let's figure it out. The nuclear club refers to the group of nations that have managed to develop, produce, and test weapons of mass destruction. According to the 1968 Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, the recognized old nuclear powers are the United States, Russia, United Kingdom, France, and China. Together with the United Nations, they are restraining the emergence of new nuclear powers. But the path of the old member countries of the nuclear club was also very difficult and began more than 80 years ago. The Americans were the first to conduct nuclear tests in 1945, detonating the Trinity bomb with a yield of 20 kilotons in New Mexico. It was the result and the crowning achievement of the famous Manhattan Project. A blindingly bright flash was followed by a wave of heat and a shock wave of colossal force. It left at the site of the explosion a mushroom-shaped cloud that stretched 12 kilometers into the atmosphere. Thousands of meters of the surrounding desert sand turned into shiny, radioactive jade-green glass. The tests were considered successful. The scientists who created the bomb were astonished. Physicist Isidore Rabi expressed concern that humanity had become a threat to all life on the planet and had disrupted the balance of nature. The test reminded Oppenheimer of a line from the Bhagavad Gita: "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." The test director, Ken Baybridge, told Oppenheimer, "We are all sons of bitches now." Just a few weeks after that, on August 6 and 9, 1945, the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki were affected by the bombing. Since then, and up to the present day, the United States has remained the only country to have used nuclear weapons for military purposes. In 1949, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics was the first to break America's monopoly on the atomic bomb by conducting a 22-kiloton test at the Semipalatinsk test site. Thus, nuclear parity was achieved. In 1952, the United Kingdom detonated its own bomb, and in 1960, France conducted a test in the Algerian oasis of Regan. Then it was the turn of the Asian powers. In 1964, China conducted tests near Lake Lop-Nur, and 10 years later, India carried out an explosion in the state of Rajasthan. Interestingly, the Indians only acknowledged their nuclear status in 1998. At the same time, angered by their neighbors' actions, Pakistan tested 6 devices in the underground tunnels of Balochistan province. And since 2006, North Korea's nuclear weapons have become a headache for the West. You could say that North Korea joined the nuclear club without knocking. And then, in March 2022, in North Korea, they are testing the Hwasong-17 intercontinental ballistic missile. Today, this 17th model claims the title of the largest intercontinental ballistic missile in the world. Its diameter is estimated at 2.4 meters, and its total mass, when fully fueled, can reach 110 tons. North Korea turned the launch of the monster missile into a blockbuster. Now, let's look at the rhetoric of the powers. In North Korea, the missile tests are positioned as part of nuclear war deterrence forces. 2 hours after the Hwasong's flight, South Korea launched 5 of its own missiles, calling it a demonstration of the ability and readiness to respond and punish immediately. In the United States, the missile launch was called a blatant violation of numerous United Nations Security Council resolutions, and it was noted that North Korea risks destabilizing the security situation in the region. The United States will take all necessary measures to ensure the security of the American homeland, the Republic of Korea, and Japanese allies, the White House statement said. Meanwhile, Russia and China's veto power makes new United Nations sanctions against the Democratic People's Republic of Korea impossible. The Japanese Ministry of Defense released a video showing the missile's condensation trail and announced that the current launch was the most technically successful in the history of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. The head of the Ministry of Defense, Nobuo Kishi, was especially concerned. Calculations show that the range could be more than 15,000 kilometers, depending on the weight of the warhead. Therefore, the whole United States territory, including the East Coast, is within the radius. Now is the perfect time to return to the composition of the so-called United States Nuclear Club. Russia, Britain, France, and the People's Republic of China are among the old nuclear powers that signed the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. The younger powers, India, Pakistan, and the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, did not sign the document. After the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics' collapse, Soviet nuclear weapons were in Ukraine, Belarus, and Kazakhstan. However, these countries voluntarily relinquished their arsenals. Some countries provide their territory for the deployment of nuclear weapons within NATO. These are Germany, Italy, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Turkey, which do not have their own bombs. Israel stands apart. The country neither confirms nor denies rumors about having such an arsenal. According to experts, the Israelis have been developing nuclear warheads since the late 1960s. South Africa also had nuclear weapons, but all 6 warheads were destroyed after the end of the apartheid regime. There is a theory that Israel helped the South Africans develop their bombs. In 2015, Iran was accused of trying to obtain its own nuclear weapons under the cover of independent nuclear energy. Tehran and the Group of 6, consisting of the United States, Britain, France, Germany, Russia, and China, signed an agreement on the Iranian nuclear program. The Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action involved the gradual lifting of sanctions in exchange for halting potentially dangerous developments. This process is not without obstacles. At the beginning of 2022, the Federation of American Scientists counted approximately 12,700 nuclear warheads in the possession of 9 countries. About 90% of the weapons belong to the United States and Russia. Here's a breakdown by numbers of how the warheads are distributed within the nuclear club. Russia, 5,977. United States, 5,428. China, 350. France, 290. United Kingdom, 225. Pakistan, 165. India, 160, Israel, 90, North Korea, 20. However, it should be remembered that no country discloses the exact number of warheads in service. In addition, about a quarter of the world's nuclear weapons have been retired from service, but have not been dismantled. Now let's return to the question of how technologically easy it is to join the nuclear club. So what does it take to make a nuclear bomb? There are 2 simplest designs for atomic bombs: the implosion type and the gun type, as well as their hybrids. The gun type is considered a bit simpler. In it, one piece of uranium-235 is literally fired by a gunpowder charge into a target made of the same material. The point is that this element in the piece must be at least 80%, and ideally more than 90%. Both pieces have a subcritical mass, so by themselves, they cannot start a chain reaction leading to a nuclear explosion. However, their almost instantaneous coming together allows for quickly reaching the critical mass needed to start a chain reaction with the parameters required for a nuclear explosion. The speed at which the 2 pieces come together, like in a cannon shot, is critically important here, because if it's too slow, the chain reaction will have time to heat up the pieces and start the process of their evaporation. In this case, the power of the explosion will be greatly reduced. The cannon-type design is simple to set up. If you have uranium-235 of the required enrichment, any artillery factory can make the cannon itself. This type of bomb was dropped on Hiroshima on August 6, 1945. The simplicity of making the ammunition also has its downside. The critical mass needed for a nuclear explosion is more than 15 kilograms. The Hiroshima bomb had imperfectly refined components and contained even more uranium than necessary. A higher mass of the munition doesn't just make it less compact. Where to? A more serious problem is that enriched uranium-235, the fissile material, is very difficult to obtain. In natural uranium, the uranium-235 isotope makes up only 0.7%, while the rest is the heavier uranium-238, which does not sustain a chain reaction. To raise the concentration of the uranium-235 isotope to 80 or 90%, the United States during the Manhattan Project used an extremely energy-intensive diffusion process. In this process, uranium is first fluorinated to uranium hexafluoride, then heated to 56.4 degrees Celsius, which causes the hexafluoride to boil. In its gaseous form, it is passed through a series of membranes. The heavier uranium-238 is gradually separated, and as a result, enrichment in the uranium-235 isotope is achieved. This whole process is extremely energy inefficient. The American diffusion plant consumed 3 gigawatts of power, which is about as much as 3 large nuclear reactors or a whole dozen decent thermal power plants produce. As a result, the plant lost economic competition to Russian producers who used centrifuges. In them, artificial increased gravity is created during rotation, and the heavier molecules with uranium-238 settle down, while those with more light uranium-235 remain higher. Uranium enrichment using the diffusion method is so expensive that it is not used simply for financial reasons, and the use of gas centrifuge technology requires the highest technological level from the operator. Let me explain with an example. In the 90s, when the Iron Curtain fell and Russian fuel producers, now the company TVEL, were able to start supplying the international market, it turned out that their fuel was objectively cheaper. Then, in the United States, they wanted to build their own gas centrifuges to compete with Russia on equal terms. This started in 1995. 16 years later, by 2011, they reached the first test launch of a centrifuge cascade. Consequently, some were destroyed spectacularly. After all, modern centrifuges for these purposes have a rotation speed of 1,500 revolutions per second. This is the cutting edge of human technology. It's very difficult to achieve in a short time. It takes decades of gradual improvement. It ended so sadly that the American government did not renew the license of the corporation that was in charge of all this. Consequently, the gas diffusion program was terminated for being too costly, and the centrifuge work was interrupted. The United States has long had no domestic producers of nuclear fuel, and even less so its own production of weapons-grade uranium. So it turns out that only a handful of people can really possess these technologies. Iran, China, and several other countries have their own centrifuges, but China buys them from Russia. Some players initially imported the technology, while other countries spent decades and huge financial resources on these technologies. However, as we have already noted, there is another scheme. Not a gun type, but an implosive one. There, not uranium-235 is used, but plutonium-239. The fundamental difference here is that plutonium can be obtained without these two inconvenient conditions. Either the first, which are too expensive in terms of energy and finances, diffusion methods, or the second, extremely complex centrifuge installations. In addition, its critical mass is about 6 kilograms, which makes it possible to create significantly more compact nuclear warheads. This is a plutonium-239 ring 11 Seadimanikion in diameter, weighing 5.3 kilojoules made in America. This amount of plutonium is enough to make an atomic bomb with an efficient beryllium reflector. This type of fissile material is produced in a nuclear reactor where uranium-238 captures one of the neutrons and becomes plutonium-239. However, it's not that simple here either. If uranium-238 is exposed to the neutron flux from the reactor for a long time, there will be too much of it. Plutonium-240. It forms when uranium-238, having just absorbed a neutron, becomes plutonium-239 and then immediately captures a second neutron, turning into plutonium-240. The latter produces too strong a neutron background, and if it makes up more than 7% of the plutonium used for nuclear weapons, the risk of the entire project failing increases sharply. After all, the implosion scheme involves an explosion that compresses the plutonium element of the device. With too high a neutron background at the very beginning of the explosion, which creates the conditions for a nuclear detonation, the fissile material will heat up and evaporate prematurely before a full reaction can occur. This will destroy the atomic device itself, but it won't produce the planned explosive yield. You'll end up with a very expensive but relatively harmless firecracker. So, weapons-grade plutonium should contain little plutonium-240, specifically less than 8%. This can be achieved by exposing uranium-238 to the reactor for only a very short period of time. Technologically, these should be reactors that allow you to quickly insert and remove rods with uranium-238 right during operation. In conventional ones, this is technically impossible. In theory, there's nothing impossible about creating a different type of nuclear reactor, such a highly specialized weapons grade 1. In 1942, the Americans built the world's first reactor entirely out of natural uranium, without any enrichment. To slow down neutrons to speeds at which uranium can capture them most effectively, they used graphite as a neutron moderator, which they cut on regular woodworking machines. For strength, the graphite structure was reinforced with a wooden frame. Nevertheless, someone had to design a reactor in which a rod with uranium-2388 could be quickly inserted and removed. An extremely small number of people know how to design nuclear reactors so that they actually work. And again, only a few countries have such scientific and organizational personnel, and doing this secretly from other states is practically impossible. However, to all this, a curious viewer might object that a dirty bomb can be made without advanced technology. Theoretically, that's not a problem. You could take a mixture of certain chemical elements, which we can't name since we're not allowed to provide practical instructions. Fill the tubes, which are usually loaded with nuclear fuel, with this mixture, and put them into regular standard reactors for about a year. Then take them out and use the material to fill any simple rocket or even an artillery shell. But you can't get any weapon of mass destruction this way. The number of casualties from radiation contamination won't be much higher than from the explosions of such munitions themselves. Producing the necessary amounts of dangerous isotopes takes a long time. They're hard to store, and it's impossible to do all this secretly. You can still make a couple of rods and quietly put them into shells, but no country in the world can secretly fill thousands of rods with the necessary elements, set up mass production, and create hundreds or thousands of dirty bomb-type munitions. And what if you try to fill a dirty bomb not with a special mixture of elements, but with spent nuclear fuel? You could try, but there would be two problems. First, spent nuclear fuel is most dangerous when it's noticeably hot. Not all of the most dangerous isotopes in it have burned out yet, but hot, spent fuel is very inconvenient to put into any kind of munition. And again, there's very little use for such dirty bombs. Most of it consists of long-lived isotopes, whose radiation is fairly moderate, and even traces of shorter-lived elements don't help much. Such spent fuel is dozens or even hundreds of times safer than the optimal mixture of chemical elements that has been in a reactor for a year. So theoretically, any country will retain this dirty bomb potential as long as it has at least one nuclear reactor in operation. But in practice, dirty bombs are ineffective in a military sense and absolutely suicidal in terms of public relations. That's a brief summary of the price of joining the nuclear club. Of course, in this episode, we didn't cover uranium mining, nuclear power, various nuclear reactor technologies, and much more. But we'll leave that for future episodes. If you're interested, let us know with a like and a comment. Should we start working on it? Although we do have something about autonomous nuclear generators, check out the link below. Thanks for watching. See you on our channel.